And now a little story from the Appleseed.
Skeeter grew a giant pumpkin in 1988. It weighed 480 pounds and it won all the prizes at the county and the state fair. See, in the summer of 1987, his girlfriend, Charlotte, she's named after a breed of cow. His girlfriend, Charlotte, and her mother, Helen, moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because their home life was terrible, and they just needed to get away, and Skeeter was heartbroken. They were still a couple, but this was in 1987, and we didn't have communications like we have today, so Skeeter wrote Charlotte a letter that fall, and he said, Charlotte, ever since you're gone, I'm heartbroken. I don't know what to do with myself. And he sent it off, and a week later, he got a letter back, and he opened it up, and in the envelope was a packet of giant pumpkin seeds, and a letter from Charlotte that said, do something constructive. Grow a giant pumpkin. Gargantuan produce are a balm for the brokenhearted. So it was November. You can't grow a giant pumpkin in November. So Skeeter just started to research what you needed to grow a giant pumpkin. And one of the things he found out was that you needed a fertilizer that was rich in phosphates, potassium, and nitrogen. And he showed up at my house one night with some burlap sacks and 2 shovels, and he said, come on. And I didn't even ask where we were going because I didn't want to ruin the surprise. But it turns out that we were going to the $50 Baptist church. And we broke in the back door, and I said, why are we here? And he said, I need to get some fertilizer. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, giant pumpkins need a fertilizer that's rich in phosphates, potassium, and nitrogen. As you well know, the attic of the $50 Baptist church has been infested with bats for over a decade. There are tons of guano up there. So we're going to get it from up there because that's rich in what we need. And I said, well, do you think that when Charlotte said do something constructive, she meant break into the $50 Baptist church? Skeeter said, she knows I think outside the box. And so I said, why are we breaking in, though? And he said, because, that's our style. And I said, why don't we just ask? And he said, I doubt that pastor has forgiven us. 10 years ago, we had a little run-in. I said, that was 10 years ago. You'd think the guy'd forgive us by now. And Skeeter said, that pastor's not a very forgiving fellow. And that was true. He said, plus, if we're going to take crap off the Baptists, we're not going to ask for it. So we went up into the attic, and we spent the rest of the night shoveling guano into burlap sacks and carrying it across the midnight streets of $50 West Virginia, and we dumped those sacks of guano into a giant hole Skeeter had dug in his backyard, and we filled the hole in with dirt, and then we were standing there on our shovels, and I said, what now? And he said, we wait for the guano to fertilize the ground. And I said, do we have to wait here? And he said, I guess we can go inside. And so, while growing giant produce is a balm for the brokenhearted, waiting for bat guano to fertilize the ground really doesn't do anything for you. And so, Skeeter traveled to Charleston, to Morgantown, to the University Library to find out how to grow a giant pumpkin. And when it came about 4 days before the last killing frost in the spring, Skeeter went out and he planted his pumpkin seeds in nice little rows, and 7 to 10 days later, the plants started to emerge and the vines started to grow. They flowered and the pumpkins started to grow on the vines, and we would go out and stand in the pumpkin patch and just look to see which pumpkin we thought was going to be the biggest, and they were all growing pretty well, but there was one that was definitely outgrowing all of its kin. And so Skeeter decided that was going to be the giant pumpkin, and he put a padded pallet underneath of it because you have to think ahead when you're growing giant produce. Because when it comes to move it, it's a 480-pound pumpkin, you got to be able to move it. So you put the pallet underneath of it to begin with, and then you can just drive a forklift or whatever under there and pick it up. And we would go and we would sit and we would watch the giant pumpkin grow, and Ferndale came over. She was a friend of ours. You have to understand, I lived in a town called $50 West Virginia. We had 2 streets in $50. One was called Main Street. The other one was called, that ain't Main Street. And so there wasn't a lot to do. And one day a reporter showed up, because there wasn't a lot to report on either. And he asked Skeeter, because here's a kid with no farming experience, not even any gardening experience, who's growing this giant pumpkin. And he said, why are you growing a giant pumpkin? And Skeeter said, well, because my girl moved to South Dakota, so you know. And the reporter didn't know. He was writing an agricultural column, not a love column. And so he changed tact, and he said, what's your secret, if you don't mind sharing? And Skeeter said, well, some people are seed people, some people are manure people. I'm a manure person myself. And the guy said, what kind of manure did you use? And Skeeter said, bat guano. And the reporter said, how do you spell guano? And then he said, why are you using bat guano? And Skeeter said, because it's rich in all the nutrients the giant pumpkins need. And the guy said, where did you get hundreds of pounds of bat guano? And Skeeter said, we went to the Lord. So, I'm not exactly sure why, but we referred to this giant pumpkin as the bored gourd. Fern named it, I guess because it didn't have a lot to do, except grow. But pumpkins can grow, giant pumpkins can grow 40 pounds a day. So you can almost literally watch them grow. And this one was getting so big that it was starting to tip off the pallet that it was on. And so we took some 2x12s and we sunk them in the ground, and we made kind of a hammock so we could put the giant pumpkin, the bored gourd, up on that hammock. And as we were doing that, Skeeter said to me, he said, when people grow giant tomatoes, they use a bra to support them. And I said, I don't think we're going to find a bra big enough for this pumpkin. And so we were sitting out there one day, me and Skeeter and Ferndale, and just at the edge of Skeeter's yard was a barbed wire fence, and on the other side of that fence was a bowl. And that bowl belonged to Angus Fester, who was Charlotte, Skeeter's girlfriend's father. And Angus hated me and Skeeter for lots and lots of reasons, and that hate transferred to his bowl. So that bull hated us as well, and I don't know what it was about that giant pumpkin, but something about that pumpkin was driving that bull crazy. He would stand in the field with his big bull eye kind of staring at the pumpkin, and bull slobber, and then he would ease a little bit closer and stare some more, and then ease, and then he would get startled and run away. I don't know if it was that the giant pumpkin, as it expanded, if it squeaked, maybe it gave off some sort of high-pitched squeal that only bulls can hear, but finally, one day that bull snapped. He had just had it with that giant pumpkin, and he just came charging through the barbed wire fence. He was headed straight for the bored gourd, and Fern, before even Skeeter and I could get out of our seats, Ferndale jumped up, grabbed like a 6-foot piece of 2x12 that was laying there, braced it against a tree over here, held it like this, like a matadorus with a board instead of a sword, and the bull went just smashed right into that 2x12, and its horns just went right through, impaled, and the bull stopped. It didn't know what was happening now, and so it just stood up with this 2x12, wandered back into the field. And Skeet and Ferndale and I sat back down, and about 10 minutes later, Angus Fester's truck came tearing into Skeeter's driveway, and he got out, and he had that board with the 2 holes in it, and pretty soon Sheriff Hasbro pulled into the driveway. Clearly Angus had called Sheriff Hasbro, and Sheriff Hasbro and Angus Fester also did not like each other for lots and lots of reasons, but Sheriff Hasbro was a good, honest sheriff, so he came even when Angus Fester called, and Angus held up that board, and he said, Sheriff, these kids hit my bull with this board so hard that it stuck on my bull's horns. And Sheriff Hasbro said to us, is that true? And Ferndale said, Sheriff, I don't think even the 3 of us working together would be strong enough to swing a board hard enough to stick it on the bull's horns. And Sheriff Hasbro said, well, what did happen? And Ferndale said, well, we were sitting there, and all of a sudden that bull came charging through the fence, and I jumped up, and I picked up that piece of 2x12, and I held it, braced it against that tree right there between the bull and the bored gourd. And the bull ran into the board and then walked away. And Sheriff Hasbro said, let me see if I have this straight. He said the bull came charging through the fence to gore the bored gourd, but you held up that board, and the bull gored the board instead of the bored gourd? And Ferndale said I couldn't have said it better myself. So we passed it. Well, then Sheriff Hasbro said to Angus Fester, you make sure that bull never comes in this yard again. I don't know what it's got against the board gourd, but Skeeter, for the first time in his life, is doing something constructive, and I don't want your bull to mess it up. So the pumpkin finished growing, and we took the board gourd to the county fair and the state fair, and it won all the prizes, and all the 4-H kids and the FFA kids gave Skeeter the stink eye, because, you know, he was a city kid, and here he was growing this enormous pumpkin. But what do you do with a 480-pound pumpkin when you're done with it? Well, I'll tell you, some people donate them to food banks, but we didn't have a food bank. And so we took it down to the $50 Baptist Church, because the $50 Baptist Church pastor hated Halloween, but he loved pumpkin chucking. And pumpkin chucking, you need to look this up. Just search engine it when you get home. People take giant produce and they build catapults and trebuchets, and they just launch produce for hundreds and hundreds of yards, and then it explodes out there in the middle of a pasture. And so the pastor would go around town and collect everyone's used jack-o'-lantern, take it down to the church, and he built catapults and a trebuchet. And this year they were they weren't tearing the Baptist church down, but they had to abandon it because they just couldn't get rid of the bats. And if they tore it down, that would tear up the bat habitat. So they were just going to build a new church in a different place in town. But the steeple was still really sturdy. So the pastor had built a trebuchet on the steeple. Now, a trebuchet is just, apparently you know, but it's a pole. And on one end, there's a counterweight, and on the other end, there's a sling. And so you raise the counterweight in the air, you put whatever you're going to launch in the sling, and then you drop the counterweight, and when that happens, you know, it flips over and it slings whatever you're going to shoot. And the longer the pole, the farther the counterweight has to drop, and the heavier the weight is, the further you can send giant produce. And so the pastor had gotten a telephone pole and built a trebuchet on the steeple of the church. And we raised the counterweight and put the board gourd in the sling. Charlotte had come from South Dakota to see this happen. And the whole town was there. Sheriff Hasbro was standing there, and the pastor let go of the counterweight and the trebucheted. And now the board gourd was a lot of things. The board gourd was a balm for the brokenhearted. The board gourd was the thorn in the side of a bull. The board gourd was an award-winning pumpkin, but the board gourd was not in any way flight-worthy. And it went up, but not very much, and then it just started coming down, and it went right through the roof of the $50 Baptist Church, and we heard it smash through the ceiling, and we heard it hit the ground, and the walls of the church just fell like this, and there was sawdust and shingles and pumpkin bits and bat guano flying through the air, and the Baptist pastor was wiping himself off, saying, "Boys, boys, boys, stained and tainted," which is a reference to an entirely different story. And the crowd was silent. And Sheriff Hasbro looked at Skeeter, and he said, "I don't know how you did this." He said, "There's no way you could have planned this. No way. But even when you set out to do something constructive, you do something destructive." And Skeeter turned to the crowd, and he said, "Ashes to ashes, pumpkin to bat guano." And everybody went wild. And then Skeeter and Charlotte went to South Dakota to go to college, and I went to my college, and Ferndale went to her college, and we weren't all four together again until the next summer. Late that summer, we were driving around town like you do. We went past the field where the Baptist church used to be, and in that field, there were hundreds of bat boxes. And beneath those bat boxes, there were hundreds of giant pumpkin plants. And Skeeter just sort of gave a silent salute to the brood of the board gourd.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.